Hello and welcome, and thanks again for joining with me as we continue our journey through the book of Proverbs. Up until this point, we found that Solomon has focused a lot upon what I would call basic principles. Those are kind of fundamental, foundational truths about life. They've usually not been short, pithy sayings. They've oftentimes been long, descriptive monologues about the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, truth and falsehood, wisdom and folly. He personifies it a lot, where he talked about wisdom as being a woman and also folly as being another woman, being an immoral woman, and who leads those astray who give ear to what she has to say. And so it's this call from the first 9 chapters to really encourage us to seek to lay hold of wisdom, because he says it's the most important thing, it's the principal thing, it's the foundational thing. But what we do now in chapter 10 is there's really kind of a shift from those long statements about certain values and truths and principles to what we call individual proverbs, and from which the book, of course, gets its title. A proverb is just a short, pithy saying. You know what the word pithy means. It just kind of sticks in your mind. It's cleverly constructed and put together in a way that it's easy to remember, that makes it easily and very quotable. And it often does so by setting up, contrasts and comparisons. I mean, for example, in verse 1, after it begins by introducing us to saying, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, it says, instead of Solomon speaking about his son and the things he wants from him, he simply says, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son, grief to his mother. So here he has this contrast between a wise son and a foolish son, and the impact that those kinds of different sons will have upon their parents. To the father, it will bring him joy if his son is wise. It's a very positive and uplifting reflection upon him. If his son is foolish, in other words, he disregards the guidance, the truth, the experience of his parents, then that will bring grief to his mother. And it's interesting because it somewhat makes a distinction between the way mothers and fathers react to the behaviors of their parents. And part of that is that, women tend to be more holistic in how they view things. They both think about things, but they also feel them emotionally. Men tend to be more disconnected from the immediacy of their emotions, and it takes a man quite a while sometimes to make the connection between what he sees cognitively and what he feels about that emotionally. And so this is a real distinction between men and women, and is in this age where there's an attempt to try to say men and women are basically the same thing, you realize really quickly that they are very different in how they see life and how they approach life and how they experience life. I think about something that I've had people talk to me, and it's really going all over the internet quite, the idea that Barack Obama's wife, Michelle, is actually a guy named Michael. Well, I don't trust any of those kind of things that are said, but as I was watching her do a podcast with him and watching their different ways of addressing a problem, I came to the conclusion that Michelle is a woman, because her view of life and him and things and situations really were very typical of how a woman. She was very much about her feelings, her emotions, how things looked to her and felt to her, where Barack was trying to be the sensitive male, but he couldn't betray his real, true maleness. So be that as it may, or whatever you may think about that, I think it's all just a bunch of online hoopla that really doesn't make any difference in the bigger scheme of things. But having said that, I think it's important for us to understand that this is really the first set of parables, and it deals with the most essential or central part of our life, and that is the relationship of husbands and wives, the relationship of parents with their children. You see, I was going through Genesis this morning, just looking at how God basically laid out the world and organized humanity, if you will, and there were really 3 key institutions that go back to the creation. That first of all, God created the family, Adam and Eve and their children. That's the foundation of every society. If the family falls apart through divorce or death or other things that can come in, that family begins to fracture and begins to suffer as a consequence. And that's why divorce has had such a devastating impact upon our culture, because it breaks the covenant of peace between family members, and that lack of peace replaces it with a lot of strife and chaos and division. So God's intention from the very beginning, before there was sin and before there was death, was that the foundation of human society would be the family unit. And then secondly, he created a governmental structure where he said men will rule over the earth. And then thirdly, he said they would keep the Sabbath day holy. And this becomes really the beginning of the dynamic of worship. The idea that the society is to be built around these three things: through the family, through government of society. There needs to be rulers and rulerships. It doesn't indicate what kind of government, but it just says that we should be ruled, that we need to be under that kind of governing authority. And last of all, that we need to be a worshiping people who are centering really the focus of our life and the agenda, even the legal system of our life that government is supposed to enforce and uphold, is based upon God and His Word and His truth. So these are really critically important things to begin to understand, so that when Solomon starts off talking about living a life that's blessed and fulfilled, he starts by talking about the number one institution upon which everything rests, and that is the family. And he says, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother. And immediately we're basically giving a hint that children who are intended by God to be a blessing can, if things go wrong, become really more of a burden, even a curse. I mean, the fact that children are meant to be a blessing is really revealed, for example, in Psalm 127, where he says in verse 3, sons are a heritage from the Lord. In other words, that's saying that children are God's best gift to us. The best thing that God can give us in this life are children. And many people are losing sight of that. They'll recognize it one day when they're older and alone, and they'll wish that they had family members around them. But children are our best gift. In fact, in the Jewish community, especially in ancient times, the greatest tragedy was to end your life without a family, without children. And so this was always a high priority. And I think that high priority is connected to God's purposes and His plans and the way He made us. But he says basically they're the best gift that God gives us. They are a reward from Him. So the fact that we can have children is considered to be the luckiest thing that can happen in our life. That doesn't mean they don't bring sorrow, but he goes on to say that like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. I mean, what is a warrior that has no arrows in his quiver? And again, he goes, blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Now, here this may be stretched, but the average quiver in those days held about 14 arrows. And so he says, blessed is the man who has 14 kids. Well, that may make you blush and blink, but the point is that he wants us to have that perspective that having children is a blessing from God to us. And he says, and he goes on, he says, they will not be put to shame when they contend with their enemies in the gate. This family unit, when it deals with the enemies at the gate, and there are many enemies at the gate. That's just something that in this day and age gets overlooked as well, that we think that the world out there is a safe place. But as soon as sin and death entered into the human equation, the human experience, because of Adam and Eve's sin, there have been enemies at the gate. And there are various gates, where there can be gates on the outside of your house. Is your house secure and safe from intrusion? But secondly, we have to think about the gates of our eyes, our ears, even the gates of our mind. And those are some of the areas where we are most vulnerable to invasion and having really dark and ugly things put in our way. So how do children become a protective barrier against that? By simply being so prominent and so present, and their needs being so important and so primary to what we do, what we think, what we say, how we act. In other words, it's this concept that children are always watching. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they are watching and looking at us and following our example or rejecting our example. And a child who has had parents who have set good examples, not perfect examples, but basically they look at your life and say, I see the trajectory of your life is to draw near to God, are children that are blessed, and they are able to become the barriers that help protect that family unit. When parents don't take that responsibility and become frivolous and uncaring and allow their children to kind of grow up by themselves and make their own decisions without parental guidance or without parental restrictions, those children will bring grief into your life. And they will not be a blessing, and they will be a curse. You know, it's one of those kind of sayings today. We often hear people saying, well, there's no such thing as bad children. There's just bad parents. And to some degree, that's true. But at the same time, we have to understand that there are bad kids too. And sin is a capacity that exists in every person. So even kids growing up in a good home can make the decisions to follow bad examples. And for that, the Bible says they are personally responsible. They can't blame their parents. Well, anyway, I've kind of popped the cork on this one. So let's move on and we'll continue the conversation tomorrow. Many blessings.